The wind is sharp up here. Thin air. No cell signal. Just rock, sky, and a drop that falls away into nothing. It's September 29th, 2012. Somewhere along a remote, unmarked stretch of Rocky Mountain National Park. The kind of spot that isn't on any trail map, isn't in any guidebook. A place you'd only find if you already knew exactly where to look. A husband and wife are here, alone. It's their wedding anniversary. She's smiling. She trusts the man next to her completely. She has for 13 years. He's positioned himself just behind her, near the edge. What happens in the next 10 seconds will end with her body at the bottom of a cliff, 50 to 100 feet below, and it will take investigators years, 17 anonymous phone calls, and one very incriminating map to figure out that this was never an accident at all. This is the story of Harold Henthorn, and here's the twist that makes this so disturbing. This isn't the first wife he's buried. Daily Crime Case presents the husband who got away with murder twice. Before we go back to where this all started, if you're new here, this is the kind of case we cover every single day. Real crimes, real consequences, told the way they actually happened. If that's your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you will not want to miss where this story goes. Because what you're about to hear isn't just about one death on a cliffside in Colorado. It's about a man who built an entire life and 2 marriages on lies. And the first time he got away with murder, it convinced him he could do it again. Quick question before we dig in. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far this channel reaches. Now, let's go back. Back to 1995. Back to the beginning of Harold Henthorn. Colorado, 1995. Harold Henthorn is 39 years old, and if you asked around, people might have told you he was a businessman, a fundraiser, someone who worked with nonprofit organizations. That's the story he told anyway. The truth was simpler and a lot less flattering. Harold didn't work. Not really. He lived off his wife Sandra, who went by Lynn, and had for years. Lynn brought in the income. Harold brought in excuses. People who knew him described him as controlling, evasive when it came to specifics about his job, and someone who always seemed to have an explanation ready, a little too ready, whenever questions came up. At this point, nobody suspected Harold of anything sinister. Living off a spouse isn't a crime. Being vague about your career isn't a crime. But somewhere in that basement office of his, behind the vague talk of business trips and fundraising calls, something darker was forming. Harold had decided he didn't want to be married to Lynn anymore. Not divorced, not separated, gone. Without telling her, he did something that would look completely unremarkable on its own, but would later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence investigators would ever find. He took out a life insurance policy on his wife, worth $600,000. At the time, nobody knew. Lynn certainly didn't. Life kept moving. They still went out to dinner. They still looked, from the outside, like a normal married couple in suburban Colorado. But Harold was already planning. And one night, that planning would turn a routine drive home into a crime scene. The night it happened started off completely ordinary. Harold and Lynn went out for dinner. Nothing special, nothing that would raise a single eyebrow. Just a married couple having a meal together. On the drive home, Harold noticed something. One of the car's tires was low. Not flat, just low enough to justify pulling over. So he did. He got the jack out, started removing the lug nuts, and Lynn, being a supportive wife, got down to help him, holding onto the nuts as he pulled them off one by one. Then, according to Harold, one of the lug nuts slipped out of her hand. It rolled underneath the car. Lynn went to retrieve it, and in that exact moment, Harold says he was tossing a tire into the back of the vehicle. The impact knocked the car off the jack. The car came down. It crushed Lynn underneath it. She didn't survive. Here's the problem. There was no one else there. No witnesses. No security cameras on a dark stretch of Colorado Road. The only person who knew what actually happened in those final seconds was Harold, and Harold could not keep his story straight. Investigators noted that the details shifted depending on who he was talking to. Small inconsistencies here, contradictions there, the kind of thing that, on its own, might be explained away by shock or grief. People misremember trauma. It happens. So after a few days of investigation, without a clear reason to escalate, authorities ruled it an accident. Case closed. Harold Henthorn filed the claim on that $600,000 life insurance policy, and he collected it. Just like that, Harold Henthorn walked away from his wife's death with $500,000 and an official ruling that called it a tragic accident. No charges, no further questions, no reason as far as the state of Colorado was concerned to ever look at this case again. 4 years passed. Harold kept living his version of a life. Vague business trips, a basement office, no real job, but now no wife either. And apparently, 4 years was long enough, because in 1999, Harold Henthorn decided it was time to start over. He went looking for a new wife, and this time, he had a plan for exactly where to find one. If you're the type of person who needs to know how a story like this ends, and trust me, you do, go ahead and hit that follow button right now, because what I'm about to tell you next is almost unbelievable. This man found another woman, married her, controlled nearly every part of her life for over a decade, and then did something that took years of planning. This is where it gets worse. In 1999, Harold Henthorn joined a Christian dating website. He presented himself as religious, successful, and driven, a businessman who raised money for nonprofit causes and worked remotely from home. That's where he met Toni. Toni was 44 years old, an accomplished ophthalmologist, and by every account, a genuinely kind, warm person. She wasn't naive or careless. She was a respected medical professional with a career built on years of education and discipline. But Harold was convincing, charming even, and the two of them hit it off. They dated, they connected, and eventually they got married. From the outside, it looked like a good match, a successful doctor and her devoted, business-savvy husband. But behind closed doors, the pattern that had defined Harold's first marriage was already repeating itself. He controlled the family finances entirely. He handled all the bookkeeping, which meant Toni, despite being the one actually earning an income, had no real visibility into where the money was going or how much he wasn't contributing. Because Harold still didn't have a job, not a real one. When he told her he was heading out on business trips, he was actually driving to a nearby bakery where he'd spend entire days quietly browsing the internet. Toni had no idea. She trusted him completely. And it didn't stop at finances. Over the years, Harold's control over Toni's life tightened. Any deviation from her normal routine, anything outside the ordinary, had to run through him first. He needed to know. He needed to approve. If she was on a phone call, he required it to be on speaker, so he could listen to every word. This wasn't a marriage built on partnership. It was one built on surveillance. And yet from the outside, nothing looked alarming. Controlling behavior in a marriage often doesn't. Not until it's examined in hindsight, after something terrible has already happened. Years passed. 2012 arrived. Harold and Toni had been married for 13 years, and despite having full access to her income, despite living comfortably off a doctor's salary while contributing nothing himself, Harold Henthorn decided he was done, just like before. This time, though, Harold didn't leave anything to a roadside accident with unpredictable variables. This time, he planned. First, behind Toni's back, he took out a life insurance policy on her. This one wasn't $600,000. It was worth up to $4.7 million. Then he began researching, not casually, methodically. He was looking for the perfect location to carry out a plan he'd clearly been building in his mind for some time. He found it in Rocky Mountain National Park. Certain remote sections of the park, at certain times, are nearly empty. No other hikers, no witnesses, no cameras. Harold's theory was simple, and in his mind, foolproof. Lure Toni to a remote cliff edge, push her off, and let everyone assume it was a tragic hiking accident. People fall in national parks. It happens. Nobody would think twice. So Harold got to work. Over time, he scouted the park 9 separate times, walking trails, studying terrain, searching for the exact right spot. A place remote enough that no one would see, exposed enough that a fall would be fatal, believable enough that no one would question it. When he found it, he marked the location on a physical map, with an X, so he wouldn't forget where it was. Then back home, Harold told Toni he'd planned something special. A surprise anniversary trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. Toni, who had no reason to suspect anything, was thrilled. Her husband was planning something thoughtful for their anniversary. They packed up, made the drive, and headed into the park together. Before we get to what happened next, I want you to sit with something. He had already gotten away with this once. He watched it work. And now here he was, 13 years later, walking his second wife directly toward a spot he had scouted 9 separate times. If this story has you gripped right now, let me know in the comments and stick around, because the way this case eventually cracked open is almost as unbelievable as the murder itself. The hike started out exactly like Toni thought it would. Beautiful scenery, fresh mountain air. They took photos together along the trail, smiling, close, looking every bit like a couple celebrating 13 years of marriage. But Harold knew this park. He'd been here 9 times before, scouting, memorizing, planning. So at a certain point, he guided them off the main trail, away from the marked paths, into rougher, more remote terrain. Eventually, they reached it, the spot he'd marked with an X, a cliff edge. What exactly happened in the final moments is something only Harold knows for certain, because once again, just like with Lynn 17 years earlier, there were no other witnesses. But Toni went over that edge. She fell somewhere between 50 and 100 feet down onto the rocks below. She did not survive. Just like before, Harold told authorities it was an accident. She'd fallen, a terrible, tragic accident. But just like before, Harold could not keep his story straight. To Toni's family, he said she had fallen behind him on the trail, and that when he turned around, she was already gone, fallen. In another version of events, he claimed Toni had been taking a photo of him when she suddenly slipped. The details didn't match. The timeline didn't add up. And to people who knew Toni, people who loved her, Harold's shifting explanations started to look less like grief and more like something else entirely. Then came another decision that raised even more red flags. Harold had Toni's body cremated almost immediately, despite her family's explicit wishes that she be buried. Cremation meant there could be no further autopsy, no additional forensic examination. Whatever evidence her body might have held was gone. This wasn't just insensitive. It was suspicious. And yet, despite the growing unease among people who knew Toni, despite the shifting stories, despite the rushed cremation, Harold Henthorn appeared, once again, to be getting away with it. He was still in line to collect on that $4.7 million policy. But this time, things were different. This time, people weren't staying quiet. Local police began receiving anonymous letters and phone calls, urging them to look more closely into Toni's death, and specifically, into her husband. Over time, they received 17 separate calls and letters. 17. Investigators started connecting pieces that individually might not have meant much, but together painted a disturbing picture. Harold's first wife had died in an eerily similar situation, alone with him, no witnesses, ruled an accident. Now his second wife had died the exact same way, and in both cases, Harold had taken out substantial life insurance policies shortly before each death, and in both cases, his account of events kept changing. That was enough. Harold became a suspect. Investigators obtained a warrant to search his vehicle. Inside, they found the map, the one with the X marking the exact spot where Toni had fallen. At that point, investigators went back and re-examined Lynn's death from 1995 with fresh eyes. The changing stories, the timing of the insurance policy, the fact that Harold had been the sole witness both times. The pattern was undeniable. Harold Henthorn was arrested and charged in connection with Toni's death. At trial, prosecutors laid out the pattern. 2 wives, 2 isolated accidents, 2 large life insurance policies, and a husband whose story never held up under scrutiny. The map with the X became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case, physical proof that this wasn't a spontaneous accident, but a location he had deliberately scouted and chosen in advance. Harold Henthorn was found guilty of murdering Toni. He was sentenced to life in prison. His first wife's death was never formally retried in the same way, but for investigators and for everyone who followed this case, the connection was impossible to ignore. 2 wives, 2 nearly identical accidents, 1 common denominator. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just what Harold did, it's how close he came to doing it twice, and getting away with it both times. If it weren't for those 17 anonymous calls and letters, and a map he never should have kept, Harold Henthorn might still be a free man today. If this story kept you watching until the very end, that's exactly why we do this every single day. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment with your thoughts on this case, and let me know, should we cover more cases involving life insurance murders? Because there are more coming. Thanks for watching Daily Crime Case.